great to be with such a huge audience and such a huge audience of friends. It seemed like a bit of a reunion, so in some of the places. You know, when I was a young officer in the Amalgamated Engineering and Electrical Union, I was deeply influenced by a great industrial negotiator called Paul Corby. Paul is one of the best read people I know, and he once lovingly handed me a book by the great American journalist and politician, Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. The Jungle tells the story of the Chicago meat packing industry at the turn of the last century, and it graphically chronicles the unsanitary conditions and the exploitation of migrant labour in an industry that was crying out for reform. At the time, President Theodore Roosevelt described Sinclair as a crackpot socialist. He said, "I have an utter contempt for him. He is hysterical, unbalanced and untruthful." Nevertheless, through meticulous journalism and a beautiful writing style, allied to political campaigning, The Jungle caused such a public outcry that it contributed in part to the passage of the 1906 Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in America. And I thought about this book when Trevor Cavan, some of you may know him, of the Sun newspaper, described me as a socialist zealot. And it reminded me of what you can do when you collectively organise against powerful institutions that belligerently refuse to change. And that's why I'm grateful to you all for being here tonight. Many of you have been derided in national newspapers, in the jungle of national newspapers, because you stood up to be counted. And you're here tonight because you want political parties to hear your message of reform. And I'm grateful to you for that. So it's a very great honour to deliver this second Leveson Lecture. The Leveson Inquiry was a landmark in this country's history. It was watched online by millions, and it exposed two things to the British public and to the world in a way that had never been done before. The first was that some of our national newspapers
had sunk to depths of unethical and illegal behaviour that disgraced the name of journalism. And that these weren't just isolated incidents. They were habitual and sometimes even matters of policy. And in the judge's words, papers wrought havoc in the lives of innocent people. The second thing that Leveson exposed was that this was the work of a small group of companies, in reality a small group of media moguls, executives and senior journalists who enjoyed extraordinary power. Not only were they able to cover up for each other systematically, refusing to apply to their own industry the kind of brutal treatment they dish out to the front pages, and comment pages when things go wrong in, say, the NHS or social work or schools. In that little club of the Sun, the Mail, the Express, the Mirror and so on, fearless scrutiny was something you never had to experience yourself. Until Leveson. But of course, their power didn't stop there. As the inquiry showed us, these are not organisations dedicated to holding power to account through journalism. That's just the myth they propagate, the smokescreen they hide behind. They themselves, in my view, have become the power in the country. And look at the relationship between Murdoch's company and the police, if you want to see it. As Leveson showed us, this was so close that it was impossible to tell who was working for whom. All you could say was who they were working against, And that, in my view, was the general public, you and me. And look at the relationship between these organisations and the world of politics. I've said many times before, there is a huge amount here that shames politicians. Far too many across the political spectrum, all the main parties, yes, my party included, and beyond, have allowed themselves to be seduced into giving these papers what they wanted. Far too many have compromised themselves to gain short-term advantage. But the people who run the big press organisations and who edit the big papers led the way. They have operated like a mafia, intimidating here, bribing there, terminating careers, and rewarding their most loyal operatives and toadies. For years they could fix any legislation that affected them in a way that no other industry could. But it didn't stop there. Their influence was so great that for many it became impossible to know who was really running the country. All of this Leveson inquiry laid before the country vividly and clearly the facts. The public gasped as the editors and proprietors condemned themselves at the witness stand. Richard Desmond didn't know what ethics were. Paul Dacre, by his demeanour, showed that he did not think the law applied to him or his paper. Editor after editor, men who routinely claim they are answerable for everything that appears in their pages, told the judge pathetically that they were completely unaware of all the wrongdoing perpetrated on their watch. It was sickening, but it was a relief. And set alongside the heartbreaking testimony of these people's victims, it created what I believe was an unshakable determination amongst the British public that there must be change, and real change. Never again should those who run our big national newspapers be allowed to abuse ordinary British citizens with impunity. Never again should they be allowed to subvert the justice system. Never again should they be allowed to subvert our democracy. And that's the legacy of the Leveson inquiry. And I'm proud to be asked to give this anniversary lecture. My theme tonight, however, is unfinished business. Look around at what's going on today. In fact, let me correct that. Look beyond the lies, the covering up and the distortions in our big national newspapers, and look, for example, at what is happening in our courts. An extraordinary series of trials is revealing mountains of new evidence for what these organisations got up to. Evidence that even the Leveson inquiry or the legendary Nick Davis didn't uncover at the time. In fact, in a few cases, evidence of things that were firmly denied by witnesses under oath before the inquiry. In recent weeks, we have learned the following: that a second employee of News Corp UK subsidiary has been convicted of corrupt payments to public officials, that the judge in the Coulson Brooks trial was of the view that those acquitted brought the prosecution upon themselves by their own conduct, that a second Sunday Mirror journalist has confessed to hacking phones, that Mazza Mahmood was considered by a judge to have lied to the courts, that several prosecutions have been dropped that relied on Mazza Mahmood's evidence, that all convictions based on Mazza Mahmood's evidence are now being reviewed, that Mahmood is alleged to have known of corrupt payments to police officers, and well done to Panorama for that. That Andy Coulson faces proceedings for perjury in Scotland in relation to his evidence in the Tommy Sheridan perjury trial. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The jury in the Tommy Sheridan perjury trial were not, in my view, given all the facts they required. And the courts have heard sworn statements that phone hacking was common knowledge and industry-wide, that senior figures at Trinity Mirror actively encouraged hacking of phones, that newspaper bosses referred to their readers as plebs, that Rebecca Brooks ordered the deletion of millions of emails, that Sun journalists were told that all cash payments, including those alleged and in some cases proven to be made public to officials, had to be signed off by Rebecca Brooks, that the Management Standards Committee may have been selective in which of their journalists they chose to shop to the police when draining the swamp in order to protect some of the swamp dwellers higher up in the food chain, that News Corps stopped cooperating with the police when it became clear that cooperation would not immunise them from prosecution, that the CPS are considering against 9 Trinity Mirror journalists charges as we speak, that in all 5 court cases so far involving the Sun and the News of the World, journalists have complained of the bullying atmosphere at those papers, that the Sun has a 7-foot-high safe full of material ready to use to blackmail people, that senior journalists at News International now say they thought that paying police for tip-offs was covered by the editor's code, that the Sun bought from a police officer the witness statements regarding a rape complaint from a member of the public against 2 police officers, which included the complainant's statement listing her name, address, and circumstances of the incident. That the current news editor of the Daily Mail told a court that it is very standard journalistic practice to invent quotes. It's an astonishing catalogue, and there is much more. Although I say, leading journalists such as the editors of the Times, the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph do not seem to think it is appropriate to tell their readers very much about it. Where journalists are acquitted, of course, our national press reports it lavishly, often with a combination of indignation and hand-wringing. The papers that, for example, monster Christopher Jeffries, just because he had been arrested, now claim to be appalled to find that a reporter might be got out of bed by police, that the process of criminal law is slow and stressful, that defendants sometimes have families who suffer, that, remarkably, some people go through all of this when in fact they were innocent, or that they are suddenly, but selectively, converted to the idea that prisons are not holiday camps, that open prisons perform a valuable role, and that human rights checks and balances should apply to suspects and criminals. Will these papers learn from it all? When it comes to reporting on criminal cases in the future, will they show a little humanity towards suspects and defendants? Well, let's see. I mentioned their indignation. Boy, are they indignant. Reading what they write, you might be forgiven that the employees of the Sun, the Mail and the Sunday Times were the saints and martyrs of our society. You might believe that they are spotless, virtuous souls, constantly persecuted for their heroic work in exposing wrongdoing and keeping our society safe and fair. Now, don't get me wrong, we have some great journalists in this country, and we would be in trouble if we didn't. I was moved and delighted to see Andrew Norfolk from the Times win Journalist of the Year last night for his work exposing organised child abuse. He has nobility, and we should never forget that it took courageous journalism to expose corrupted journalism. But we also have far more than our share of bullies and thugs passing themselves off as journalists. These people shamelessly exploit the advantages they enjoy as journalists to inflict cruelty on ordinary people and to line the pockets of their proprietors and owners. The British press is not being persecuted. It is not under attack. As Leveson found, and as remains the case, there is no body of opinion in this country calling for the censorship or gagging of journalism. or for state controls, or anything like it. Paul Dacre constantly asserts that there is. And I saw that the Secretary of State for Culture and Media and Sport claimed as much a week ago. So I'd like to ask them both today, Mr. Dacre, Mr. Javid, who are you talking about? Name these advocates of state control. Who are your supposed censors and gaggers? Let's not sink to the tactics of Senator Joseph McCarthy, slinging around allegations of conspiracies without ever naming names. We know where that led. What Leveson recommended in relation to press self-regulation was, as he made absolutely clear, not state control. Parliament would never have stomached such a thing, but every party in Parliament gave its support to the Royal Charter that entirely independently of the state implements the Leveson recommendations. And the result has been the creation of a recognition panel that, in the words of its chair, David Wolfe QC, is appointed by a process which is unique in its independence from government, parliament and other influences, and which has freedom from outside pressure not seen before in a public body. And if you don't want to believe the assurances of a politician or a lawyer, here are the words of a great editor, Harold Evans, who said, "The misrepresentation of Leveson's main proposal is staggering. To portray his careful construct for statutory underpinning as state control is a gross distortion." And remember, this body's function is not to regulate the press. Its only job is to test whether self-regulators set up by news publishers meet the basic standards of independence and effectiveness needed to give the public confidence they will be treated fairly if they've got a complaint. That isn't state control or anything like it, nowhere near. But given the record of so many big newspapers, and as I say, we're learning more every day, it is the very least that our society should be doing to protect citizens when they are at their most vulnerable, and who are usually not rich enough or experienced enough to take on these big corporations. In modern Britain, we don't stand by and watch the weak being persecuted. We do something, and this is probably the least we could have done. But it's unfinished business, because this little group of greedy, cruel men have raised two fingers to Leveson, to Parliament, to their victims and to the public. They don't want fairness, they don't want change. No catalogue of the wrongdoing they've overseen would be long enough to shame them. They want business as usual, so they want ipso. They've dusted down the utterly discredited Press Complaints Commission, applied a lick of paint and a new letterhead, literally, and a new name, and announced to the world with their usual brazen dishonesty that they are complying with Leveson. Well, they're not, as the Advertising Standards Authority found and told them. In fact, ipso would not get past base camp in any effort to satisfy the independent recognition panel, which is why they are not even applying. So on the face of it, they continue to write their own code of conduct and continue to pull all of ipso's strings, ensuring that they can ignore the code wherever they choose. And incredibly, the chair of the paper that breaks it most often, by far, you've guessed it, Mr. Paul Dacre of the Daily Mail. And the victims of this are, and will be, ordinary, vulnerable people who are bullied, lied about, and intruded upon. The very people you would like to think journalism was there to protect. But here's some more unfinished business. ipso is not the only game in town. Another self-regulator, Impress, is taking shape. Beyond having in Walter Merrick's a very distinguished independent chair, which, as we've seen from ipso, is no guarantee of anything, it appears to be constructing itself in a way that implements Leveson rather than rejects Leveson. And if it applies for recognition, which I hope it will change the rules of the game. When Parliament endorsed the Royal Charter, it also approved Clause 40 of the Crime and Courts Act. And under that Act, if a new publisher denies the public the advantages in terms of access to justice and fair treatment that go with recognised self-regulation, then there is a price to pay. A paper can't just say, we don't offer cheap, quick arbitration in libel cases through our self-regulator, so bad luck, you'll just have to sue us if you can afford it. A press corporation with deep pockets can't rely on the huge costs of litigation to block justice and protect its wrongdoing. Under the Crime and Courts Act, papers that refuse to join a recognised self-regulator offering arbitration will have to pay the costs of those who sue them, whether they win or lose. In other words, it will become free to sue these titles, though of course you'll still have to have a case good enough to get to court. That's the price these organisations will have to pay. And we must always remember that the papers are putting themselves in that position are not just behaving unfairly to the public. They are also knowingly rejecting the historic new protections for freedom of the press that Leveson offers. That's right, historic new protections for the freedom of the press. The chill of existing libel laws would be removed by a new immunity for news publishers, and only such publishers, from court costs and from the risk of exemplary damages. Because what the law now says is that any news publisher belonging to a recognised self-regulator can't be bullied by wealthy institutions and individuals in the way they have been in the past. Just as the news publisher is obliged to offer cheap arbitration, so the wealthy complainant is obliged to accept it too. And if the wealthy complainant, say an oligarch or a big supermarket chain, insists on going to court, then it is the complainant who pays both sides' costs, win or lose. Now that's what I call fair, and a brilliant new protection for our investigative journalists. But at the Sun and the Mail, they don't want it, and they don't want any of their competitors to have it either, in the name of press unity. Unfinished business. Here's some more. You may not remember this, and of course no newspaper will tell you, but the Leveson inquiry is only half done. The terms of reference approved by Parliament require a Leveson 2, not necessarily led by the same judge. And what job does it have? It must do all the things that could not be done whilst prosecutions were pending. Who gave the orders for hacking, bribing and data theft? How far up did it go? Who organised the cover-ups? Why were police slow to act? Did lawyers behave improperly or illegally? How much evidence was destroyed and on whose orders? Has the criminality stopped? What are managements doing about it? And as the Watergate reporters Woodward and Bernstein would put it, who knew what and when? None of this was done by Leveson 1. For sound legal reasons, it had to tiptoe around these issues. It would need to take place after the criminal process had ended, but it is absolutely vital that Leveson 2 does begin as soon as the criminal cases are over. It's vital because the papers and others claim the police somehow got off lightly in Leveson. That's because they were not the main subject of investigation in part 1. The nexus between the police acting corruptly and elements of the press which has begun to be demonstrated by the work of citizen bloggers like Brown Moses, now Bellingcat, by Nick Davis, by Panorama and other investigative journalists, and by the campaigning work of people like Alistair Morgan, who will not let the murder of his brother Daniel go uninvestigated. They remain unsolved. All those people are here today. But it's vital also, because if we don't see this through, we're sending the signal to the editors and the moguls and corrupt police officers and the politicians who let it happen that they can do it all again and they can get away with it. And we're sending the signal to their victims that they don't matter and that we don't care how many more people suffer. Everything we know about the perpetrators tell us that they are not sorry and they have not changed. They've never, ever been sorry. They just look for new ways to hide their misdeeds, and it's got to stop. And there is unfinished business here too for politicians. One of the things we're elected to do is to ensure the weak are protected from the strong, the poor protected from the rich. We can't walk away when that job is not done. We must keep working at it. And I see 4 important jobs ahead for us in Parliament. The first is that we all, every party, including my own, need to comply with the Leveson recommendations on the contacts we have with senior journalists, editors and proprietors. There is a lot of talk about the public's right to know. Well, given the shabby history, the public has a clear right to know when their elected representatives are mixing with these people and why. All parties need to do what the judge asked on that point. The second job that falls to politicians is to ensure that we have real plurality in our news media and that no one company or individual is able to buy or build market dominance that denies the public that plurality. I expect you know who I'm thinking of when I say that. But he's not the only one. There are huge online news providers, and they will probably be just as big a threat to a free and diverse media in the future. It's the job of our Parliament and our government to ensure that in the interests of democracy, that we have a real space for a range of points of view and approaches in our news media, that it is not just the domain of a handful of big corporations. And third, we must be on the lookout for any opportunity to protect the freedoms that public interest journalism requires to enhance our democracy. That means, for example, safeguarding the role of UK law, of the European Convention on Human Rights, which the newspapers frequently rely on to protect their legitimate interests, sometimes without any apparent recognition of the irony of their position. It means, for example, seeking to amend the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000, the hacking law, to provide the same safeguards for journalist sources that exist in PACE, judicial oversight of a serious crime threshold. And I've been struck by the unlikely but welcome alliance to deliver that between the advocates at The Sun, the drafters and organisers at Hacked Off, and the parliamentary amendment tablers of the Liberal Democrats' backbench. Now that is a weird and scary combination, but it's welcome. It's always been a source of minor amusement to me that in Tony Blair's 400-page long memoir, he admits to only making 2 mistakes. One of them is the Freedom of Information Act. "You idiot," says Tony in the passage describing the Act. "You naive, foolish, irresponsible nincompoop," he goes on to say. "There is really no description of stupidity, no matter how vivid, that is adequate. I quake at the imbecility of it," he says, on his decision to support the legislation. It's funny because I love the Freedom of Information Act. I think it's one of the Labour government's greatest ever legacies. In recent years, it's helped me establish that we have a UK military personnel stationed in a US Air Force base in Djibouti, thought by many to run the covert drones programme in Yemen and Somalia. It's allowed me to establish the contents of the ministerial wine cellar, and that when 1,200 of my constituents had their kitchen and bathroom refurbishment cancelled by cuts at the Department for Communities and Local Government, David Cameron was spending £30,000 of taxpayers' money to refurbish the kitchen in the Downing Street flat. Now, if I can do this with that piece of legislation, imagine what a proper journalist could do with it. It's a powerful piece of legislation, but it has holes. And I want to see a future Labour government give something back to journalism by increasing the statutory obligations on public institutions and private ones contracted in the public sector to disclose information in a more timely fashion. And finally, we in Parliament must see through our promises to the people and to the victims when it comes to press self-regulation. To do what Lord Justice Leveson said we needed to do if the press rejected his recommendations in the face of parliamentary approval of them. I'm a Labour MP, and I want my party to commit in its manifesto to take action if the independent recognition panel produces what is called a failure report late next year. That is to say, if it concludes that the conditions sought by Lord Justice Leveson have not been met. A manifesto commitment is vital. Voters and also the victims of press abuse have to know where the parties stand on this before the election. Nothing less is right or just. We've had a rare all-party consensus on this. Now all the parties must be open and clear. Do they still believe the Leveson recommendations and the Charter, or are they quietly getting back into bed with the editors and proprietors? I think the public have a right to know. John Major said at the Leveson inquiry, when commenting on the serial failures of previous attempts at effective, independent self-regulation, up to and including the cold cut in his time, it is politicians who are in the last chance saloon. I want my party to accept the John Major challenge. That's why I'll be campaigning for a commitment in the Labour manifesto to see Leveson through. I hope the other parties will match it. And if they don't, I know the public will judge them harshly, because they will be letting down the victims they promised to protect and for whom they have a duty to protect. Finally, I want to send this message to the editors and proprietors. You are in the business of exposure, but now, at last, it is you who have been exposed. Every day, more of your wrongdoings are being laid bare, and every day you make your position worse by trying to hide the evidence from your readers, by your special pleading, by your lies and your attempts to intimidate. In your pages, you never hesitate to lecture and attack others on all sorts of matters, sometimes justly and sometimes not. But you never judge yourselves, and you can't admit that others have that right, even our courts and our public inquiries. Well, your time is up. Your lies don't work anymore. The public is not fooled. It saw clean through you back in 2011, after the terrible scandals of the McCanns, Christopher Jeffries, the Dowlers, and it still sees through you today. And your efforts to trick the public into believing there is some kind of threat to freedom of expression have failed. There is no such threat in Leveson, in the Royal Charter, or among my colleagues in Parliament. And you've not produced a shred of serious evidence to show there is. Where there is a threat to freedom, it comes from you. You've shown again and again you don't care about freedom of expression. You've never told the truth about your wrongdoings, and you do all you can to suppress the reporting of them. You don't care about the freedom of journalists to report the systematic intrusion into all our lives by the security services. If you did, you wouldn't have called for the prosecution of The Guardian in the Snowden affair. You don't care about the freedom that ordinary British people should enjoy from cruel treatment by your employees. Nor do you care about their right to have access to justice. The only freedom you care about is your own, to do exactly what you like, without consequences. Your time is up, and I want to name you. Rupert Murdoch, Lord Rothermere, Richard Desmond, Sir David and Frederick Berkeley, the Board of Trinity Mirror. Yes, there is unfinished business, but you make no mistake, it will be finished. British journalism will be raised from the mire into which you and others have sunk it, and British citizens will be given the protections to which they are entitled. And as Lord Justice Leveson showed, this can and will be done, while at the same time freedom of expression in this country is enhanced. Thank you.